There is an island in Japan called the Okunoshima Island, or many refer this as the Rabbit Island. Just as the name suggested, it's filled with rabbits and it's quite a popular vacation spot. However, within the island holds a very dark past. During the 1920s, multiple chemical factories were built here, and this became a key role on producing poison weapons. Before we deep dive on why these chemical factories were constructed, let's go back in 1925. There was a treaty that was introduced called the Geneva Protocol. The purpose of this was to prohibit the use of chemical and biological weapons in wartime conflict. During the First World War, chemical weapons were heavily used and caused a huge number of civilian casualties. So this treaty was proposed to ban the usage of these dangerous weapons. However, there is one huge loophole on this treaty. Based on the writings, it only prohibits the usage of chemical weapons, but it doesn't forbid the producing, storing, and transferring of these weapons. And so, this reason alone caused a lot of mistrust between countries. At the end, despite this treaty, several participants who signed the same agreement continued producing their own chemical weapons, and so Japan decided to make one for themselves. The Japanese government wanted to keep this a secret. They didn't want the public to even know that this existed. Given that World War I just ended just a few years after, creating these controversial chemical-producing buildings will raise alarm and cause public panic. But most importantly, a bigger concern was that they didn't want the enemy to know that they are making this product and the exact location of these factories. So the first step to keep it a secret was to pick a location. Since Japan has plenty of small islands, it only makes sense that this will be the first option. Also, geographically speaking, another advantage is that the traffic is easier to monitor, since boats are the main transportation to enter and exit the place. On top of that, being away from the big city and denser population will be the safer bet in case a poison leak was to happen. At the end, they picked Okunoshima Island. So, out of thousands of islands, why this one? First of all, it was big enough to build multiple factories throughout the island. The second reason was that very people lived here, only 3 families who came from a fishing background. Unfortunately, they were later forced to work for them once they took over. The third reason was that there wasn't much infrastructure on the way. They didn't have to destroy any existing building. With all that being said, the construction started sometime in 1927 and it was finished in 1929. They really want to keep this island a secret, even as far as removing it from the record books and the official map of the country. People on the outside simply do not know that this place even existed. Despite picking a very secretive location, they know this wasn't enough because they need to get workers to operate these factories. Therefore, extreme restrictions were implemented to keep this away from the public's eye. About 7,000 people were brought in to live and work here. The first thing they were told upon arrival was that they are forbidden to talk about where they work or the type of work they do to anyone, even to their family members. And if they break these rules, they will face harsh punishment. Not everyone that was sent to the island was aware of the main purpose of their job. They were merely sent there to follow orders. They were separated into 2 groups. The first group of workers were given basic tasks like cleaning various areas of the islands for maintenance, with the exception of the chemical factories. They were not aware about the things that went behind the scene and the chemicals that were being produced. They simply told what to do and they follow. The second group of workers are the people who are responsible for producing the toxic chemicals. They receive the worst and the riskiest tasks on the island. They are also heavily monitored and none of them were allowed to leave. Even though they were given equipments and uniforms to protect themselves from chemical exposure, this was not sufficient, and majority of the workers inside these factories suffered serious health consequences, and some of them even died while at work. Another measurement they took was to kill off all the land animals. They didn't want the risk of spreading the toxic chemicals. The only animal they spared were the rabbits, and they were used as test subjects. The poison they were producing was called mustard gas, and it was quite dangerous. Just a few grams and it can kill a person. All in all, they produced a total of 7 tons of poison, and a good portion of it was used during the wartime period of 1929 to 1945. This all ended and the production stopped towards the end of the Second World War. With World War II nearing its end, there was no use for these factories. But before leaving it all behind, documents were destroyed and the buildings were partially burned down. The workers were dismissed and were told to keep their mouths shut about the place and pretended that it never existed. As for the leftover poisons, the canister were simply put in a concrete and dumped in the local ponds. However, there is a huge problem with this, because some of the canisters eventually leaked and the chemicals spread into the nearby villages, which contaminated their drinking water. Over 300 people were affected by this, and they suffered serious long-term health conditions. It was only years later when these chemicals were acknowledged and the chemical factories were found. The island left a very dark past. However, about 18 years later, unexpectedly, it now became a huge vacation spot. So you might be wondering, how did this island that has such a dark past become such a popular tourist spot? Well, it's mainly because of these little creatures. Huge numbers of them roam around the island and it became the main attraction. The rabbits are tame and the tourists will visit just to pet them. There is no exact clear answer as to why there's so many of them on the island. It is believed that these are descendants from the test subjects. However, some are skeptical of this and believe that all of the subjects were killed off before the factories were abandoned. Which, if you look at this way, it makes sense since they want to eliminate any remnants of the poison as if it never existed. So, if they didn't come from the test subjects years ago, how did they end up here? It is believed that around the 1970s, a school trip visited the island and the student brought a couple of rabbits with them and just left them there. Now, as for the reason on why there's so many of them years later, well, there are two main factors. One is that rabbits are known to breed very quickly. But the other factor, which plays a huge part, is that there are no land predators on the island, and when you combine the two, the island becomes a rabbit haven. The place also has a camping ground, a hotel, and a beach, a perfect spot to visit, but the abandoned chemical factories still stand today. In 1988, a museum was built to showcase the history of the island. The place is truly interesting. Notorious for its dark past, now become one of the cutest places to visit.